Welcome to the Neurogenic Integration Podcast, where we explore the incredible potential of neurogenic tremoring beyond the basics. I'm Alex Green.
And I am Sylvia Song-Shields. Together, we'll be diving into how this natural, innate process can be seen and applied across different professions, healing modalities, and in scientific research.
Whether you're a practitioner, a coach, a therapist, a body worker, or a researcher, this podcast is for you.
Join us as we uncover the science, share experiences, and explore how neurogenic integration is revolutionizing the way we approach stress, trauma, and well-being.
So take a breath, get comfortable, and let's dive in. All right. Well, I am super excited to be sitting down today with Joel Began, and Joel is a physical therapist based in Henniker, New Hampshire. And let me tell you a little bit about Joel and how Joel first came on my radar, and then I'll talk a little bit about the exciting conversation that we're going to have today about neurogenic tremoring and spontaneous movement. So Joel is a physical therapist, a somatic health educator, a primitive reflex clinical specialist, a TRE tension and trauma release provider, a safe and sound protocol provider, as well as a musician and a personal trainer and an exercise specialist. So very broad and diverse background. And he's the physical therapist at his business, Creative Pathways PT. So Joel, thanks so much for coming on for a conversation today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alex. I'm super excited to be here and to chat and to have some fun.
Yeah, super cool. Well, so let me just talk a little bit about how I got to know you. And then also I want to talk a little bit about what it maybe is on the menu. Every time you and I have spoken, our conversation's been a little bit meandering. So I don't want to make too many promises because I don't know for sure where our conversation will go. But we can at least set some sort of intention. So anyway, I think it's probably been about 2 years now. And so Joel is a TRE provider. So TRE is the modality of neurogenic tremoring developed by Dr. David Briselli. And Joel's a provider, I'm a provider. And on a Facebook forum for providers sharing information, I noticed there was a thread, I think it might even have been about physical therapy, but Joel posted a paper that he authored along with some others in 2022. And that'll definitely be something that we cover in today's conversation. But it was a paper about describing spontaneous movement, including the kind of tremoring we see in neurogenic integration and TRE. And he sent me a copy of the paper and I read it, and it was like a complete breath of fresh air to me because it put into language, it was a collaboration with, I think, three, four other professionals, or Rolfer, and Joel can tell us who else, a little bit international. I think somebody from Brazil is in there. Right. But basically, the really quick summary that you can, I hope I don't get it wrong, is in lots of therapies, movement, in manual therapy modalities, movement therapy modalities, some spiritual practices, spontaneous movement arises. And sometimes that's shaking and tremoring, sometimes that's stretching, sometimes that's undulations. And the question being articulated in this paper is, what do we know about this phenomenon? And there are modalities that utilize it, like TRE, like myofascial unwinding, continuum movement, et cetera, et cetera. There's modalities based around this principle, but what do we actually know physiologically and neurophysiologically and otherwise? And part of the breath of fresh air that I felt in reading the paper was, in many ways, I have exactly that same question. So for me, coming in as a bodywork therapist, structural integration trained, and then later in Feldenkrais movement training, from the very beginning when TRE first came on my radar, that was exactly, it was like, wow, I'm seeing this. I've had this happen. It's happened to me in bodywork. It's happened to me in acupuncture. When I'm doing bodywork, I see this sometimes. And it was only until I came across TRE did I even find somebody who was even talking about it in a substantive way. It's sort of mentioned here and there in some of my training. but not a lot. And so what I really appreciate about Joel's paper is just asking the question of, yeah, where do we see this? How is it being languaged? And how might we begin, and I like the word begin, to ask meaningful questions about this, and also acknowledging that this is largely absent from the existing bodywork literature, manual therapy literature, physiology, fascial literature. There's just not a lot out there, I think, is the honest answer. And so it was published in 2022, and I read it and I thought, oh, great. What an intelligent framing of this conversation and intelligent questions being asked. And I hope that this leads to sort of more steps in the general inquiry. So in any case, so I got this paper, and then Joel and I connected on Zoom over several conversations, and I got to hear not only what led up to the questions that he and his team put together in this paper, but it is the very interesting personal journey and professional journey that sort of put you in this place, Joel, of asking these questions. And so I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for quite a bit now, and so it's taken some time for you and I to schedule. And so anyway, so what do we want to cover? We want to cover your paper for sure, but I want to cover your personal background, because your own story of spontaneous movement and health was very interesting when you first shared it with me. And I also want to hear about the really unique ideas that you bring into your treatment approaches. I think all of these things would be really interesting for our conversation today.
Sure.
So that's a quick preview. Yeah, thanks for being here.
Super happy.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Joel, what if let's start with your paper.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, we can go there.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we'll probably backtrack from there. So
That's fine.
Tell me the story. How did this idea start to formulate? How did you assemble this team?
Oh, Albert, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's interesting.
How did this come about?
Yeah.
And but I better read the title too. So the
Go
paper
ahead.
is called Characterizing a Common Class of Spontaneous Movements.
Right.
And it's in the International Journal of Therapeutic Massage and Bodywork. Volume 15, number 3, September 2022. So that's what we're talking about.
And it's a fun read. It's a fun read if you haven't read it.
It's a fun read.
It's kind of light. I mean, that's the thing. We didn't put a tremendous amount of heavy scientific work into it, but we did try to tell the stories of individuals that had some of these experiences, and then some of the experiences that me and one of the researchers had in our movement world of working with individuals with spontaneous movements. But yeah, a super fun paper that really did just bring in the question of what are spontaneous movements and how can we pull together some ideas to better describe them. So we came together in an interesting way. Budeman which was one of the initial researchers that kind of did, I forgot his first paper. He's basically out of New South Wales in Australia in the environmental science. So I think his specialty is in like soil sciences, but he was bringing together a paper about fascial unwinding, I believe. And I reached out to him. And so this was a phenomenal paper.
Can you pause briefly and just quickly define fascial unwinding? I'll probably do this as we go. I'll pause you just to get a quick definition.
Sure. So I think fascial unwinding, so it's a form that uses spontaneous movement, and I believe there's myofascial unwinding, but fascial unwinding, I think, was at the time what he put together in this description pertaining to the fascial system and its characteristics of being able to be an unwinding phenomenon. I think he looked at a couple different theories behind that at the time. I don't know if that helps.
But just describe it really in layman's terms. So I think I'll do my version of it, because I was John F. Barnes trained. That's sort of one common sort of myofascial release system. And there, myofascial unwinding refers to the idea that sometimes you're doing body work and then a person might start to spontaneously move. Sometimes it's tremoring, but that's not the most common expression that we see, that we describe as myofascial unwinding. It might be twisting or stretching or these types of movements. And the interpretation in this context is that the myofascia or the connective tissue is the movement is happening in order to unravel, for a better word, or stretch or reorganize.
Integrate.
Yeah. Lots of words.
Lots of words, yeah. And I think that's sometimes what can make it also difficult in exactly defining. The other one is it usually feels like it's something that we're not doing. I think that's a big one. So a lot of times if you're the practitioner behind there, the individual might say, whoa, you're moving me. And the practitioner might say, no, I'm not. I'm following you and you're moving. So sometimes that experience can actually be both ends. And I got questions there. Maybe it is. But yeah, I think the body's ability to basically unravel, unwind, reorganize, integrate, all of these things come together. I think when we start to talk about fascial unwinding in particular. And I know like Robert Schleip has some particular theories behind this work. John Barnes has some particular theories behind this work. Within the paper, that was something that we looked at, different disciplines that sort of have this phenomenon happening within their practices. And like you said, some are movements, some are spiritual experiences or practices where they're...
Kundalini yoga, the Shaker tradition, some of these,
Right. So it depends on where you are also too, and when you're what window you're looking at and where you're coming from. But all seem to have this phenomenon.
So okay. So go back to the team. So there's the one guy in Australia, and he had been doing some fascial unwinding research. Is that right?
Yes. All of us had some experience with this that we were able to say, well, what is this? Cool. And then so I connected with him. And then he sent me he said, this is something I was really interested, but not so much right now. Here's my other friend, Dorothea. So Dorothea Blostein up in Canada, she is an IT researcher up there who does a bunch with structural integration work. Or sorry, not structural integration. She works a lot with Tensegrity in the IT world. And
what is IT? What is IT?
So just like technology.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I connected with her, and from our conversations, there was a paper that had begun that she had started, or all three of the other researcher is Fernando. Where am I going to get his name here?
I'll find it.
I feel terrible because I call him Fernando.
Fernando Bertolucci.
Bertolucci, yes. And I always stumble on his name.
Is he the Brazilian? Is that right?
He is from, yes, he's from there. Or Sao Paulo, is that?
I think so.
Okay.
I think that's in Brazil, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Is he a Rolfer? Is that right?
He was a Rolfer, I believe.
Okay.
I believe so. Yeah, he's an MD too. So he comes from the MD background, and I believe is also a Rolfer, yes.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And he had developed his own sort of working with the body at that time, I think muscle repositioning. So he has a method and that he actually works with, and I think it was actually Tensegrity Touch it changed. So again, lots of versions in how we are interacting with this, but that was his work. So together they had started a paper a little while back. I want to say, when did I meet them? I was in 7 or something. I want to say it started like early 2023 or something like that. So that's when it began.
Decades ago.
These ideas. And I jumped in as the end of the wagon saying, whoa, there's a paper going. Can I help out? And they're like, well, we don't know really sure where it's going to go. And so we got, long story short, we got it started back up. We got communication going again. And then I was also a little bit of time frame from when it first had developed. So bringing in some different ideas and concepts, and when it surely came into form. But oddly enough, during that time, when we were putting it together, we got 3 people that just jumped right in with emails coming from different researchers within the group that said, I have spontaneous movements and I found your paper and what was available for at the time, and how can I get involved? And it was like, whoa, here's some of our folks to study about this. So those were where the case studies came from, case reports came from.
I see.
On that. And then we just compiled those. I took a couple case reports that we had from working in the clinic together, or working in the clinic separately that we had, Fernando and I, and then put them together and then brought in some of the language around it to explore that more.
Yeah. What were some of the modalities that you considered or included, and both bodywork disciplines, movement disciplines? You may not remember every single one, but
that's okay. I got a copy of it here. I made sure to pull it out because it was written a while ago.
Yeah, a snapshot of the different approaches that you brought together to that you felt had this commonality of spontaneous movement as significant enough to be brought
Yeah.
together in this comparative way.
Yeah, so we looked at basically some of the movement practices. I think at the time we were looking at like continuum. Continuum was one with Emily Conrad with sort of the undulating movements that she had. We looked at a spontaneous Qigong, some of the movement practices that were there. I don't think we looked at any of like Feldenkrais's work at the time.
I think that was Hannah Somatics included.
Hannah Somatics was in there, right.
Yeah.
There was one other that I think was a dance, and I think that was authentic movement. We looked at Mary Starks with some of her movement there. Yeah. The somatic experience work by Peter Levine. But TRE was on there, obviously, as well, being a movement sort of.
And and this is maybe me jumping in our narrative flow, but when you wrote this in 2022, or I guess that's when it was published, but when did you do your TRE training? We'll come back to that. But
I think that was in 2000, because we would finish the paper a year before. It takes a while to go through checks and balances.
Yeah.
I want to say it might have been around the same time, 2002. I think so.
Yeah.
2002,
okay.
2021.
Yeah. Similar time frame. So anyway, so TRE, somatic experiencing, that has what else?
So my TRE came in after. My training came in after.
You began this. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
cool.
Right. Look, this is where it was really interesting because, like, I didn't really know.
Right.
So everything I looked at, and I was able to find bits and pieces, which makes it really interesting. But yeah, so kind of looking at like the movement aspects of that. But then we also looked at like the manual therapy aspect, specifically looking at Tensegrity touch, which was one of Fernando's applications. Then there's the myofascial unwinding and John Barnes. But I believe there was another version they also had of that, also called like myofascial induction, which they've changed some of the language around. And then there was another individual we looked at, Dorco. He was a PT, but had a very similar approach of putting together tactile stimulation and then working with the body's inherent flows of movement and more of a therapeutic way. So we captured a little bit of there. I'm sure there's a lot more out there.
Yeah.
But starting to paint this picture of, look.
Right. How broad this is. That's what partly you were trying to. And then also you referenced Kundalini yoga, shakers.
Yeah, the shakers, right? Some of the working with the deities and things like that, or the gods that, But yeah, I think there was another African culture that we looked at too, and I'm going to get the name pronounced, but Candomblé.
The Candomblé, or
yeah, it's I think.
That's South American.
South American, sorry, yes, yeah. Yep. But bringing these like trance states during movement to act as like a stimulus to, again, come into some of these spontaneous movements that all of these sort of together have said have health promoting benefits to them.
Right.
And I think that was the big main.
You guys, did you guys invent this word? If you did, I'm so proud of you. But there's a cool word in there. Let me find it.
Morphogenic movements.
Okay, that's a cool word. We better get back.
We didn't invent that.
There was a great word. Wait, where the hell did it go? Hold on. Hang on. I'm going to find it. Beneceptive.
Oh, no. Yeah. When I first, that was a word that actually Fernando brought in, and I remember saying, what does that word mean? But
okay, so there was, let me read how because what the authors refer to these movements in general, the spontaneous movements, as beneceptive, meaning rewarding, appropriate, and health promoting.
Yeah.
And draw analogies to reflexive behaviors like pandiculation, natural stretching, and ideomotor action, movement driven by unconscious intention.
Yeah.
But that word beneception, I thought, that's cool that it has the perception of this being healthy. That's a great word.
Beneficial for us. I had to look it up initially when it was suggested. So.
Yeah. What do you consider, so you mapped out, again, the way I introduced this a few minutes ago when I described it is I said that the paper acknowledges that there's these class of movements that are pretty poorly defined, pretty poorly described, and not super, that in some ways I think of that as and maybe there's a main point of the paper that I missed, but I almost think of the main point of, hey, look at all these things. And almost the reason I said a beginning earlier is it's almost like articulating that this is probably an area where there's some work to do. Would you agree that's a part of the sentiment of the paper?
Yeah. Every paper at the end, right? More research is needed, and
Right.
but the goal, I think, in a lot of ways, to say, look at some of these commonalities between all of these different practices.
Yeah.
They probably all share a common phenomenon here.
Right.
And are we accessing this or not?
Right.
And obviously, I love what you're doing, Alex, putting people together that are coming from different aspects of these worlds.
Yep.
Where you're going to find stuff. But the fact that being out there and some of these are being treated with just medications to make them stop because we don't understand them, or in some cases where we reported on some of the case reports, individuals that we looked at were having a really hard time with them because there was no language. But they were happening.
Right.
And the context, I think, and I think this was a big paper in trying to bring in different context around this. So we can change a little bit of how we're looking at it, ask different questions going forward. But then also to start maybe even seeing it in front of us. Because when you start, and I always find this interesting, when you start talking to people about it, they usually say, oh yeah, I know, I see that a lot, actually.
Yeah.
When I do work. And so, yeah, that's because you're creating this.
Creating the context for
Creating the context for it. So these emerge and spontaneously. I think that's the beauty of it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. When you completed the paper or published it, and then it sounds some people would reach out because they'd say, hey, we see this. Yeah, maybe I have two questions. What conversations have gotten started because of this paper? That's sort of one question. And then the second question is, does your team there, you and the group who wrote this, is there a next step that you or any of you are working on or thinking of? So maybe those are the two questions.
Yeah. Well, here's the last one. In some ways, I think what we thought was to see what this does. And definitely, I think, on my end in particular, there's definitely interest in bringing more of those stories to the forefront. So if there's folks that didn't have spontaneous movements and went through some experiences of working with that, first of all, I'd love to hear from you. But to start to almost compile
always interesting. Yeah,
it's always very interesting because I think the authenticity of that and capturing that phenomenon, depending on what language or what framework we go through to look at this, it might change particularly. And I think each individual kind of has their own story kind of coming in, which is going to be really fun.
Right.
But I forget what the first question was. What was the other one?
First question was, did anybody, was there any outreach? Did people write to you?
Not a lot. You might be the fifth person that's read this. I counted for.
Well, the first of many, if I have anything
I
to do
hope
with
so.
it. I'll tell you what, I have shared it with at least 20 people, like directly. Awesome. So I think that at least about that many have read it.
Yeah. If you're looking to go out of where you are now and and the language that you're using to understand this, and especially if you put some of the pieces together for yourself, and this can help you go outward more. And I believe every single one of these sort of frameworks gives us another clue about this phenomenon. It gives us, when going into it, even playing with it might be fun, but there are definitely different avenues of this that you start to see, especially for me, like the unwinding phenomenon. Can it be done? Of course, you jump into the fascial research a little bit, where TRE uses quite a bit of oscillation and I guess in some cases quicker movements in the beginning, but not always the case. Where John Barnes may start with a longer, drawn-out fascial tensioning. Well, we're dealing with two very different ways of receiving some of that information through the connective tissue, but both may actually lead to the same place.
And one may become the other. I don't know how often in John Barnes' work, I think sometimes it moves into tremoring, but certainly in TRE, tremoring often, the oscillating quality of it will pause and then move into spiral movements and stretches and things of that nature.
Well, that word oscillation too, and I think about a lot of times movement in general as being an oscillation property or experience. So in a lot of ways, these smaller kind of fast oscillations are probably part of larger oscillatory behaviors. So we can have them both together. And this idea of having almost choices and different variations of this. I think that becomes a little bit of the art. I hear people talking about that all the time, but I know I'm jumping a little bit here, but even in some of the Biotensegrity world, looking at complex systems and things like that, again, emerging properties, well, that's spontaneous. We didn't talk about Biotensegrity in that paper, but the idea of spontaneity within a system is largely part of that.
Yeah. Super cool. Can you talk about one or two of the case studies in the paper that come to mind, where just examples, the kinds of examples you used to illustrate the case studies?
Yeah, I think in one case that we looked at, there were definitely some histories, I think, as there is with all of us, but there was recent surgeries for some of these individuals, and that started off with some of these sort of spontaneous movements, and I'll present two. The first one, where he had a history, I think it was a nasal surgery, actually, that ended up leading to basically some spontaneous movements in the upper trunk. Shockingly, a lot of these individuals, the movements actually occurred more up here in the body. And he got really interested in it, and to the point where he was saying, wow, this is feeling good. So this was during
It was
COVID.
Beneceptive.
It was
Good.
Beneceptive, yeah. So he started following these. Well, this guy he's a hard worker. He put in, I want 8 hours a day type of deal for a whole summer. And the stuff that he reported as far as not only his postural experiences changing, but ease and movement as far as like across the board, even eyesight, taste through the sensory systems. He was giving so many awesome feedbacks. We didn't put this in the paper, but he also was doing it when he had COVID. And actually he said it took a completely different turn, working with some of those sensations during that process that he felt really helped him manage a lot what was happening with his conditions.
Yeah.
The other case report so he had a great time with it. He taught his friends it. So after he had learned some of these things, he went out and started teaching his family. He started teaching some of his friends, and it works, and they're doing it now. So here's this idea of no formal training.
Right.
But learned through the process. And then went out. Here's a role of, we've seen this with healers. We've seen this with healers that have done similar experiences, I think.
Right.
And so that was a really fun case study. The other individual that we looked at, he's an older gentleman, both males, his experience with some of this, I don't believe, yes, he has a shoulder surgery too, but he was an avid swimmer, kind of growing up, almost like Olympic. He was very active, but had a history of chronic back pain, and it was a surgery that he had, but then he started having some of these sort of what he described, I think, as almost like liquidy based kind of movements that he felt in his body, things just sliding and moving. And from there, he started to notice some of these twitches that really were disruptive to him. And they weren't comfortable, and in some cases actually were painful. So, but during the process of this, when we were asking, he did notice things changing. He saw things softening up. He saw his posture changing. He saw his body getting better. But even that, he didn't have a context of really explaining entirely what was happening to him.
Yeah.
But I think throughout the process, he did say things are getting functionally easier for me, but this process doesn't feel good.
Yeah. These two examples are great. It strikes me that there may be this sort of percentage of people who the phenomenon begins however it does for them. I've heard a lot about it I've seen the onset of it quite a bit through bodywork. That's one example. I've had a lot of people come where it began in meditation. I feel like that's another common onset where people do say sitting meditation of some sort, and it's out of there that somehow some movements start to arise, and then they're wondering, they get curious about that. I've had a lot of people where the initiation of it was through some psychedelic experience, and where during some psychedelic medicine or journey, or even in breath work, psychedelic type breath work, spontaneous movement arises, and then they're investigating it. But anyway, and then just other ones too. Yeah, post-surgery, I've seen those kind of cases too. But it strikes me that some percentage of people, like in a way the two case studies you gave, are people who get curious. They think it's beneceptive. They follow it. They devote the time to seeing where it goes. They're a bit open-ended in their exploration.
Right.
If there's a little discomfort, so like some people may have that approach. And then I think there's other people who are pretty mystified, who think something's wrong, will try to inhibit it, get scared of what the phenomenon is, or not necessarily scared by it, but don't have the sort of open-ended time to just give it space and the curiosity to it. So it strikes me in that larger group, what I expect is a larger group of people who can't DIY it completely, that there's the role where educated professionals, whether they're movement, body work, whatever it is, people who do have a framework, it strikes me that the potential for facilitation is probably the lion's share of individuals for whom this starts would benefit from some skillful facilitation. I wonder if that's your impression as well, or
There's sometimes I jump in like the music context to understand this, because we got people that are really trained classically from 3 years old on, and then you got other people that never did any training that play only by ear.
right.
You can still play music at the end, and sometimes those combinations of the two actually work really awesome together. Some of the best music can come from that. But yeah, I think when you have a framework to go by initially, whether you start in something like yoga or Kundalini yoga, where this is easy. If this thing comes in while you're doing that, it's you found Kundalini, go with it, right? You did it. Yeah, it's like a Qigong or spontaneous Qigong. It's the Qi has arrived. Go. And
Do
it's
it.
easy. Yes, it's so different than if it just shows up.
Yeah.
And I think what's fascinating sometimes is, I have kids that I work with that are in the classrooms doing the wiggling and moving, and some will actually tremor their bodies.
Sure.
So here we are, right? And there's no context around this. In some ways, they're probably being told to stop. But having a framework to work with this stuff, I think really, I've always been told, like, you have to have a container. It has to be held within a container. Otherwise, you can spiral out. And you can pick your containers, it's probably fine, or jump between containers. But have access to a container. And I think initially with some of my own experience with this, luckily at the time I was also going through PT school. So I was getting both languages simultaneously when I had some of these experiences show up in my life. So it wasn't super scary, even though I was kind of being told, like, you got a brain tumor. These are all signs and symptoms of brain tumors, which, okay, sometimes they can be, but which is scary if you're being told.
Of course, very much so. Yeah.
Or you're being possessed by evil spirits. Be like, I am? Well, I didn't know that. Who do I talk to now? It just depends on who you meet along the way. It can send you in completely different
No, you're
direction.
absolutely correct about that. Depends on who you meet along the way.
Yeah,
Yep.
and if you meet somebody cool that kind of gives you some, hey, you know what? Hey, look, you found something. The game changes. I always tell people I was lucky to run into Gil Headley before I went to school and before I ran into some of this stuff. But by the way, everyone will go on a trip, go hang out with Gil Headley and take some of his courses and see for yourself inside the body. But it gives you a reference point. And for me, it was like, well, maybe with some of this stuff that's happened to my body, I'm moving some of that stuff that I had moved through with some of those courses that I saw with my hands physically. Okay, I can go with that.
Yeah.
It gave me an understanding at least to say, I'm okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm okay anyways. If I'm not, I'll get checked. But let's see where this goes.
Yeah. No, and let's unpack a little, as much as you're comfortable sharing with that personal story. I think that would be great to include.
Yeah, it's important.
One quick question around the paper before I forget. I don't think this is in there, but I just want to ask is, did the paper look at all about, so you definitely looked at the modalities that you included, some of the explanatory frameworks involved. Did you guys discuss autonomic state changes or polyvagal state changing? Did that come up?
We brought in the parasympathetic, what we believed that a lot of this, was the body accessing parasympathetic states, which I think jives well with some of Stephen Porges' work surrounding some of these processes of where our body heals.
Yep.
And if we can get there into those sort of default network states, then that's where our bodies are going to start to regulate. The mindfulness work and that stuff is important, but it's energy. It's using energy.
Yeah.
So, and I think you mentioned that with the quietness spaces and things. So we didn't directly address it, but we discussed
Yeah.
about the parasympathetic state responses
Yeah,
that
because
we
what strikes me, and a curiosity I have for you is, what strikes me is that of all the modalities that you guys included there, the two I know best are TRE and somatic experiencing, because these are core things that I practice. But and in both of those, there's a little bit of the sort of the explanatory model for understanding the spontaneous movement is a bit similar. The polyvagal lens, but also Peter Levine articulated the sort of the completion of the threat response cycle. And so in Peter Levine's languaging, that tremoring would be viewed as a completion or a discharge of incomplete motor responses, and it would often correspond with the completion of sympathetic or fight-flight motor behaviors, or it might also represent a transition from the freeze immobilization sort of death state, as that tremoring might also emerge during that context. And that's also what Dr. Berselli observed. He found this sort of in real life context with a lot of intensity in war zones and things where he was seeing it emerge. And so I think both of them really resonated with sort of the analogy of the human to the sort of the wild animal, and this behavior commonly occurring around post-stress. Again, either fight or flight resolution or freeze immobilization resolution. And what I'm wondering is, and so I know that's baked right into the thinking of somatic experiencing and TRE, but I'm a little bit curious about like continuum, myofascial release, the Biotensegrity people, maybe even the Kundalini yoga people. And I know you're not like directly an expert in every single one of those modalities, but I'm just wondering like, no, but I'm wondering like, how similar or different is the explanatory model from these other frameworks as compared to this one that I was describing?
I think it's important to also look at where they discuss continuum, right? And Emily Conrad. And understanding, I like to understand where the person came from that created it. Just like in music, why did you create the song? And I like that question a lot because I find it so rich. Emily had quite an interesting history, I think, growing up, where she had some actually really interesting injuries to her abdominal area. Okay. Some of what, I never got to meet her. I came really close, but I think she passed right before she was coming out this way, but we had plans to connect. I was really bummed about that. Really interesting woman just coming. Okay. But I think she had a really hard time with some of her abdominal areas of her body, to the point where I think she was actually creating self-harm in some ways. Without knowing it, there was something that wasn't healing for her that was tied to something deeper. And where I think she first experienced some of these undulating movements was one period at night where she was in bed. And this is reading from some of her book, I think, where some of these just movements she started to feel overcome her body, and for the first time kind of feeling just at ease with herself. John Barnes had a pretty significant back injury that laid him out for quite a while when he was lifting really heavy weights at one point. At least, again, his story that was told by him. And he needed to find solutions to some of that stuff. I think Feldenkrais with his knee injury.
Right. Yeah, right.
And then along the way, you tried to make so people don't think you're crazy with what you're starting to explore and experience, but it's happening. You're feeling better, and you're not doing it the way that you were supposed to. So what do you do? I don't know. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I zoomed out there, but having that coming from some of those frameworks for those individuals. Trying to I can't remember where you're initially.
Yeah, well, I had mentioned like the explanatory mechanism for Peter Levine is that sort of the completion of motor responses, and also that transition from the sort of the shifting from sympathetic arousal into baseline parasympathetic, or shifting out of from the thawing of a freeze, so to speak.
Okay.
And I wonder if that languaging, if there's parallel languaging, and I can't remember in Barnes' work enough if there's that component.
I'm not sure. I remember hearing in the back of my head, you just want to tune into the right radio station. You know?
Oh yeah, I remember that. Channel 3. Yeah, Channel 3.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I can't find Channel 3. Like, I'm on Channel 9 or something.
Yeah.
But I think now, I forget where I read some of this, but the interaction between sympathetic and parasympathetic simultaneously and the wiring that we have here. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways we look for very linear type of behavior patterns. We're either going up or going down.
Yeah.
And why can't we do both or simultaneously? And I think, again, looking at some of the Biotensegrity world, the freeze state in some ways, they deal a lot with like compression and tension. I'm not an expert in any of that stuff. I've done a little bit of work with that group to understand some of their language. But I asked a question about freeze states at one point, and from my understanding, when there's an actual equal balance between compression and tension, when they perfectly align, it's stillness, but it's moving. Movement from both of these in a way that's providing energy, but they're canceling out and creating stillness.
Yeah.
So like thinking about this and starting to think about compression and tension when they're perfectly aligned, how they actually can create stillness and balance, but it's still kind of energy.
Right.
And you use the word biotensegrity energy. It just starts to be like, whoa, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah.
But I think at least in this paper when we were writing it at the time, I think we looked a lot at just trying to say more of a parasympathetic response that we're essentially trying to achieve with the body and in those places.
Yeah.
Which we did put together like some criteria about how these things can come about and what are some of the characteristics about some of these things with there being like arising spontaneously, like a criteria. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some sort of like stimuli that you bring into the system that does that. So for example, like TRE, we put the body on certain stretches, certain pressures are usually being placed on the body depending on the position that you're in, which I find really interesting, different positions that offer different pressures at the same time. But then also that parasympathetic response of being able to experience letting go of kind of the body, a reduction in tone perhaps, but also like the environment that is being set up by the person or how it's being perceived by the individual.
Right. How's it being contextualized? Yeah, no, it's so fascinating. Yeah. And
I think a lot when you start to look at those components, even I think some of these states of consciousness shifts too, of saying, I'm feeling like I remember hearing some of my clients that are doing this in myself. I said, ooh, I can't think about the detailed stuff that sometimes I think about. My brain doesn't want to, right? Not in this space. I'm outside that mindful, heavy place. And this feels nice, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I don't know why I'm thinking about this right now. It's like it's a slight non sequitur, but maybe not completely. But I'm thinking about people where their experience began outside of where there wasn't initially a context or much of a container, as you shared. And I'm thinking about Richmond in Australia, and he's also a PT. But his story was he always describes his initial foray into spontaneous movement. And I'm pretty sure for him it came during a Vipassana meditation retreat or several of them. And then it set up a thing where something was just happening. And he always describes it as, and I've heard the story other places too. I've heard it described in other contexts as well, but where suddenly he would find himself doing movements that there's no way he could consciously do. That if he had decided I'm going to put my body into this shape, or things that might even look like a yoga posture or something, that there would just be literally no way of him doing that intentionally. But because it was being led at another level, suddenly, so I'm just thinking of these kind of, in a way, more dramatic examples of expressions and the sort of the surprises that can emerge.
Yeah. I think in the context that we put together as far as what things can come about, I think we use the word combinations, permutations of different available movements that are that we have in sort of
Right.
those automatic spaces of our brain. The
Yeah.
brainstem in a lot of ways holds all of our automatic sort of properties. So being able to have access to those reflexively for that matter, and I think, yeah, what does the body create? Is it, or it's essentially creating jazz here? We're putting together some really different notes and creating some really unique sounds, or some really unique, in this case, postures. And looking at kind of the response of our body with the environment. And I think now we can say in a lot of ways, like, our responses are faster than the nervous system. This gets really interesting, right? If a nervous system is moving at a certain speed, yet reflexively we can move a lot faster. First of all, what's the nervous system for? I have questions. But vibration and oscillation properties can move through the tissue 12 to 20 times faster than that of what gets propagated through a nerve.
I see.
So being able to access that by doing something mindful, almost setting the body in motion through a technique like TRE that then brings you into this other space. Yeah, we're starting to look at some of Newton's laws here, right? Of once you set something in motion, it can continue to stay in motion under the right circumstances. Yeah, we're going to be on delay. We're going to be a little bit behind with us kind of processing that. And,
yeah, interesting.
And this is where I think the following comes from a lot, where we say, follow it. Yeah, that's all you really can do. Even we know this with language and conversation, right? We've already had this conversation in some ways. We're
Right.
saying things that we know, but we're truly improvising.
Right.
And what does a really good improviser use for a lot of this stuff? It's things that they trained with. It's things that they know, that they're bringing to the surface in the moment in really different and unique ways that allows for, in this way, maybe the body to complete something, or the body to experience something different, which I think it's amazing that we've found ways into accessing some of this stuff and using this, and it's cool. It's cool to be part of. Yeah, yeah. That's where I get lost a lot, just trying to wrap my head around and stuff. But but the more and more I think, especially now with some of the sciences that are coming out, I can't keep up with it anymore. Honestly, Alex, stuff is changing left and right, but in cool ways that I think's just letting us say more and more. You know what? Yeah, just go with it, because if it's working, go with it. Because what we thought was wrong in a lot of ways, the idea that muscles actually don't move a lot and that they just isometrically contract, but we move in the way that we do, is still mind-blowing to me. Talk to the Biotensegrity people. They'll explain it better.
Yeah. No, that's an area I want to go more into. Okay. Yeah.
But that's where you come back to the oscillation world, and that's where, again, we say, ooh, look at people oscillating with TRE.
Well, something I was reading recently, you might know about this more than me. I was reading, I think, some paper about, I was trying to see, every once in a while I look to see, is there any new paper that describes some tremoring, whether it's spontaneous or something. Is there anything new in neurophysiological research? And I was reading something about tremoring as from a sort of the perspective of the sort of muscle spindle interactions. In the paper, and I'll have to dig it up, this was a skim kind of a thing, but this is probably not news to you, but it was, what struck me was that what's being described was that pulsation or oscillation is always happening, and at a certain level, and then there's certain conditions in which that's amplified into perceptible levels. And I found that an interesting way to think about it, because I'm thinking about this from a TRE or a somatic experiencing perspective, where what's the level at which we start to perceive this? Obviously, if you do something to set in motion neurogenic tremoring, like through TRE, most of the time you're going to get quite feelable and quite visible spontaneous movement, right? Typically speaking, somebody watching would be able to see that movement. And of course, you can feel it. But so that's one level of amplitude of rhythmic, oscillatory, myofascial activity. But to me, there's lots of examples where there's vibratory phenomena that gets set in motion. I've had this happen lots of times for me, it's been most likely with acupuncture, but it could be any form of bodywork, craniosacral therapy, osteopathy, hands-on, somatics, Feldenkrais work. If my body and nervous system has been touched in a meaningful way, then even though I'm not going to likely to have big visible oscillations like I do when I tremor in TRE, very often for 12 to 24 hours, there's a very perceptible vibration that I can feel. And of course, now I can interpret that as energetically, I could interpret it as chi flow, or if I was in sort of a TCM perspective, which I think is a good way to look at it. But I've come to believe that it's also, I also now believe that it's a quite literal vibration. It's just not big enough to be moving my bones around. And so now I'm thinking of it like the sort of this continuum or the spectrum of when I'm quote unquote in stillness. Well, there's at the literal level, there is not stillness. Of course, I'm breathing and my heart's beating and the cerebrospinal fluid is moving. So we know there's those movements. But even at the neuromuscular level, what I gathered from this paper is that oscillatory movement is happening. Now, sometimes it's happening more. If I get Tai Chi or acupuncture or something, I can feel it, but I'm not moving around. Nobody's seeing that. Well, now I could do it even, I do a breath work session or a TRE session, and now I'm literally in the visible spectrum of tremoring. So now I'm thinking of this kind of continuum in a sense.
Yeah, like tremors inside tremors or movement inside movement.
Right.
And even like a postural sway of just standing is going to be a slower kind of sway.
Sure.
But yeah, then go all the way to the other side of the spectrum, the nitty gritty ones of where you might feel little fasciculations. They happen in our sleep all the time. And we know that they help with the healing process and the remodeling of the brain. So I think, especially in infants in the beginning.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's like, there's starting to become better language around that. And what do you do with that? Can you respond to that? But yeah, it gets really interesting. And I jump to like music a lot because I feel like in some ways they've started to have this conversation of hearing multiple melodies simultaneously.
Yeah.
And being able to hear several at the same time type of deal and different ones at the same time. But we're talking about listening and the ear, the vestibular system that's organized to gravity. They're on the same line here, cranial nerve 8. I don't know, just saying. Even though they're talked about very separately, one organizes us accordingly to gravity. And
You're talking about the auditory and vestibular are on the shared, on the eighth, the cranial nerve 8?
Cranial nerve, yeah. They're taught very differently, but they splice right into each other. And I think what we're learning about nerves and how nerves feel and what's going, are they talking? I don't, maybe.
Yeah.
They're split off the same damn nerve.
Super interesting.
Well, I ask a lot of people that question, and I don't get many answers, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because earlier you talked about so often we use the word follow, and I didn't say it when you said that, but a phrase that I use a lot this is especially true in somatic experiencing where first we're going into felt sense, but then it's oftentimes some spontaneous activity. Doesn't necessarily mean it's big movements. It just might be breath changes, sensation changes, the head moving a little bit. And a phrase I use a lot is listen and follow. That's in a sense the instruction that I give. And the listen part is because even though it's maybe not, I don't think of it as literally acoustic, but the sense of listening to what's occurring. If you bring and then the follow is then give permission or allow. And so that pairing, listen and follow, is a common language that I use when we're tuning in.
Yeah, it's probably some means of regulation that we're probably doing with the body, co-regulation within ourselves. And in the music world, we call and answer is a talking conversation that you have all the time in music. But some people are better at talking and some people are better at listening. And it sucks if you're with somebody that just likes to talk all the time and doesn't want to listen. But that give and take a lot of times, or following listening, there's something there. And we see it played out in a lot of other things too, or other disciplines. Yeah. So I think we're coming into that space now. Yeah. And now we're bringing out, we need to bring out language for this process. And are there some common things that we can experience? And what do we give them for languages? I ask kids this all the time because I ask them what's going on in their body because I work a lot with them. And they will tell you push on their arm and you tell them what else changed. They'll tell you if they know if they're given the permission to look somewhere. Sometimes they don't need to be told. Just, I can feel something else in my leg. But I usually tell them, say, look everywhere, not just here, look everywhere. And we're playing. We're starting to play. We're starting to practice this skill. That's probably very much available. As we get older, sometimes you press on something and it says, well, how does that feel? It's okay. And what else do you feel? What you just did, like on my hand.
Yep.
But what else? What do you mean?
Oh, yeah, that's so cool. Well, Joel, let's hear a little bit about your personal story if you're willing. You've alluded here in this conversation to while you were doing PT school, there was something you were tracking and you were a little bit interpreting it from a PT lens, but sounded quite particular to you. Will you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I just hit a wall basically when I was 20, was I 23, 24 at the time? I'd gotten out of a really long-term relationship. I just built my house for 2 years and then I just did my first year of grad school. And I think I had some downtime that summer, which was an interesting part of the program. Normally they don't anymore, but so I wasn't going to get a job. I was like, but that was when I first started to basically notice some really interesting things start to happen with my body. I just hit a wall. And I remember one night saying, all right, I need to stretch my arms. And in particular, I think I was working with patients, a lot of hands-on work, but as a student. I was a personal trainer for 10 years prior to that. So I was comfortable working with people. But what was interesting to me was all these techniques that I was learning and getting excited about. And then I'd go home and try them on myself, and they wouldn't help. And so I was starting to
They would not help, is that you said?
They didn't help me, no. So I was seeing them work with my patients, but I wasn't seeing them work with me, and I was starting to get frustrated.
Yeah.
And saying, why can't this work for me?
And was it, when you say work on you, was it like what were you noticing as not optimal for you? Like pain phenomenon or dyskinesia phenomenon?
I was uncomfortable. I think I had built from this house from basically the foundation up. I really remodeled everything. I kept the skeleton, but I had done quite an extensive amount of labor for 2 years without any rest. I had in my mind that I was going to take on this project. And then after that, it was another project, right? The brain says, oh, this isn't good enough. We got to go do something else. So maybe that was, but now all of a sudden in school, I'm sitting still. I'm not moving that regular lifestyle that I was doing and distracting. And so all of a sudden now I'm having to sit and study at night. So I think over time that just built up, and I started to need to do more exercise, more mobilizations, but I wasn't getting to the level that I needed to clear my mind and to be able to sit with the studies and the work that I needed to. So I was just starting to get quite frustrated. And I think there was just one night where I was laying down. I was really not in a good place. And I said, I don't care. I need to move my shoulder. I need to bring this up. And I'm just going to push as hard as I can. I don't care. I'm at that point. So I threw my arm back with everything I had. And I heard a big pop. And I said, oh, my shoulder. But then I said, I don't feel any pain. And then all of a sudden I saw my other hand start to tremor. So, and it, for me, replicated the same thing I just did. I could feel a pull from basically the back of my shoulder, just my arm going, ooh, boom, and then same replication on that side. So a lot of times that TRE phenomenon, right, that we see left to right, right? So hemispheres talking in some way. But at the time, I didn't know that. I didn't understand any of the neurology that could have been happening there or what my body just experienced. But I felt some relief after that. It was a very clear, and sometimes what I hear after folks that sometimes go in for learn TRE for the first time, it's like, wow, things just got completely, it's what I felt. But I think after that time, it wasn't like I just started tremoring from that point on. You know, I was going back to school, I think a couple months passed, and then I started to notice just some movement in my arm. And I said, whoa, I was sitting with my buddy next door, and next to my lab, and I said, hey, Tony, look at my arm. And he goes, yeah, that's good. Yeah, you're moving it. Good for you. And I was like, no, and you can see how this goes next, right? No, Tony, I'm not doing it. And that's where I started probably getting
this
my labels.
This is where a psychiatric referral for you.
Yeah, or even better, when you go to your professors and you say, hey, look, you see their eyes go, you need to get that checked out. I said, why? I feel okay. I feel good.
Yep.
But so that started to basically, I think when I started doing that, I said, well, I'm going to squeeze with it. I'm going to just actually squeeze the muscle. And then I would get like almost an opposite motion that kind of came through. And then I'd say, oh, okay, cool, relief. So I had that familiarity of that sort of relief pattern. And then I saw another fasciculation start to happen higher above. I said, oh, I'll follow that. So running this in my head a little bit, oh, that's that muscle. Let me squeeze that muscle. And then another motion would happen. So I just kept following that until some of the motions became a little bit bigger and a little bit more broader. And slowly over time, it was for me more of pulling and deep sort of fascial stretching.
Okay.
But there were definitely times and positionings that it was way easier to do on the floor. So like a lot of this I would play with and sitting, but I eventually found my way to the floor and started some of that work there. And I couldn't get enough of it. I thought I could feel every time I went into space and did some of this work, I was coming out with just this vitality and this strength behind my body and of course feeling at ease was, wow, this is great. So I did that. I had the summer off. I spent a lot of my time like in between that kind of walking outdoors and just collecting myself. But I saw huge changes. I saw huge postural changes. I saw a lot of my body come back to me in a short amount of time. Yeah. So, but I also put in a lot of the hours behind that.
The time. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I have questions on the speed of some of this work, but there were times where there was a lot of just skin driving work. I couldn't get enough of moving the skin. It did seem like a lot of this went from the outer shearing kind of movements to deeper in.
Interesting. Yep.
Which a lot of times is what we do when we're first born.
Yeah.
And I probably should mention too, I was a C-section baby. I was preemie as well. Who knows if that was a piece of not, but that process returning back to school was just like, whoa, I had a very different perspective on the body and how things worked. No doubt. Right. And luckily along the way, I had some folks that I was able to be in contact with this experience that were almost a little bit of a mentor in the process. Yeah. And saying, you're good, you're exploring, keep going, right? You're in an okay place. This was my experience. And I was like, okay. But so that was what I carried through, and 15, 16 years ago where that kind of started. But over time, it just settled, got less and less. And like you were describing, more of that sensation of just being felt in the body, just sitting here. There's movements that are there, but nowhere to the point of needing to, they're not distracting. They're just part of the voluntary stuff now. So I think about it from an integration standpoint, and it gets confusing, as I think in a lot of ways, and I'm not saying that my body is like perfectly integrated or anything like that, but it's definitely in a better place than I think it was at that time, and in a more balanced place, movement-wise. And I'm more aware of a lot of those things that at the time I was doing that I think are like, whoa, I was inflicting some discomfort on my body. I was unaware. And so
amazing. Yeah. No, that's so cool. No, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
That personal side. You mentioned there was a few mentors. You were lucky to find some mentors who were encouraging and whatnot. Were there any of the opposite? Were there any of the opposite experience? You were in PT school. You have access to experts in physiology, et cetera, et cetera. Did you bring some of the questions that ended up making their way into this paper 15 years later? Did you pose any of those questions to some of the faculty?
Yeah. Well, there were some interesting conversations that came out of that. And there were definitely some perspectives that were like, no, we know movement's good and keep moving. Let your body move. And there were those takes. There were other people that were like, I don't know what you're doing, but I think you have a tumor and you need to get that checked out immediately. Oh my God. I don't want to talk to you anymore. But then there were definitely like, I don't know what this is, but this is weird.
Yep.
It's everything in PT school is a lot about controlling the body, putting it back to certain places with certain techniques, or at least using those. I think the language is changing now. A lot of the fields are changing where we're coming to more of a way of saying we're suggesting something to the body, but there's expectation behind techniques.
Of course.
Times. And I think in this type of process, it's definitely like what you get is what you get. And it's the fun part.
Yeah, totally. Hopefully it's beneceptive.
You like that word.
No, I'm going to start using it.
But definitely.
All right. Well, I want to be mindful of our time. Maybe let's do one more section, which is, I guess I'd love to hear, how do you You mentioned earlier people start to so much of it is who you meet along the way, right? Like you've got a process going. Do you meet a Qigong teacher? Who do you meet? And some of those people are going to be encouraging. And I thought to myself, ever since you first, going back 18 months, when you so extensively weighed in on a question about my infant at the time, I came to the impression of, I was like, wow, anybody who finds their way into Joel's office, that's some good karma. They met a unique person and a unique healer. So I'm a little, so when you mentioned that earlier, it depends on who you meet. That's what I was thinking today. I was like, yeah, well, the people who find their way to you, I think those are some lucky individuals because they're finding their way into a person with a significant personal experience of some of this stuff, and then also just the creative and sensitive person that you are. So could you share a little bit about how treatment works for you? It might be nonlinear, or maybe it's linear. Maybe you have a process. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how some of these ideas find their way into your actual clinical work with kids and adults.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I do work with both. I work with kids, adults, and then I sometimes work with both of them simultaneously, and that sometimes gets really interesting, teaching through multiple languages, but together. But in a lot of ways, I'm looking for some of these. I use them for tests now. So I am a physical therapist. That's as much as I tried to fight it along the way. I was placed here. So I have to use that language in a way that I can also pull in this other stuff and honor what I was taught through those experiences. So for me, primitive reflexes gave me that opportunity to work with the spontaneity and also have language behind it to present to people about some of these.
Okay. So unpack that, because lots of people listening are not going to know what you mean by primitive reflexes and the field of reflex integration. So give us a little one-on-one on that.
Primitive reflexes, the movements that basically build us. Some of these within utero and the ones that once we start to engage with outside. But our first interactions essentially with the environment come from movements that essentially are programmed in the brain. Now, there's some other research that actually show that some of the spontaneity may actually be there a little bit first and then the primitive movements. But we use those as our beginning, as the movements that are intuitively we know to start to interact us with the environment.
What are a few, like the Moro reflex or the sucking reflex?
Right?
Or
Yep. So some of these the doctor checks for in the beginning, and some people, there's stories behind each one of these reflexes in a lot of ways of what they're useful and purposeful for. But oftentimes there are first kind of protection pieces also too that allow us to interact with this new environment coming out. So the Moro reflex in particular is that one that sort of some people believe is the first breath of like arms open, legs open type of deal, and they check for that by taking the baby and bringing it backwards, and if you see that, you have an intact nervous system essentially. But one of the first oscillations, right, essentially is this kind of motion going out, arms over the head, legs straight out, and then everything curling back in to the body. Think of just with those motions of of what we do, from CrossFit overhead movements with the barbell to some of the fetal positions that we encourage people to go in when we see it with TRE.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Are we engaging with some of these reflexes? Are in some ways, but we know that those sort of reflexes, amongst others, like the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, those are basically movements that allow the integration of the vestibular system, the auditory system, but also get us rolling on the ground. When it looks like a fencer pose, where the arm and the leg come up like this, and you look over and almost like a little bit of a warrior in some ways.
Interesting.
Right? You start making connections, but I don't know if they're entirely. But these are useful for us to start to build our body, but also our brain. And we're not thinking about them. They're just there. And there are certain tests that you can do, and a lot of these are sensory-based and movement-based, to check to see if these pop up on an individual. And we know now with a lot of things like neurodevelopmental conditions, autism, OCD, that these underlie, or at least are significantly related to some of these conditions. We find them in a lot of these individuals that have them. But the same thing with individuals that have injuries or to the brain or to their spinal cord. Even post-COVID, we're seeing some of these things. When these movements don't follow through, and normally they clear out a lot of them and then become postural reflexes that we can then use to orient ourselves to gravity. But they're usually, a lot of them are cleared by 12 months, and if they're not, then we call them retained. So those are the ones that I'm looking for in individuals. So there are certain tests that you can do to see, even just like having a person turn their head to the side, and if an arm bends, then possibly there may be that reflex that is available.
Is retained.
And it's retained.
I see.
Taking your finger and kind of draping it across a person's face, across their lips, for rooting that we would use to first learn to feed with as an infant. If that happens, or we see puckering of the lips type of deal, then those are all things that we can say, oh, these are retained, right?
Yeah,
these
I
are
see.
distracting, and they're reproducible in a lot of ways when we test for them. Some of them are not full-blown movement patterns that you would see textbook, and some people look for those. And how I was trained in a lot of ways is sometimes you just get bits and pieces of some of these motions. And a lot of times when I work, so I'm looking for those initially with kids, and I have a whole list of reflexes that I go through to test for especially with children, but the same with adults, looking at those.
And somebody shared with me, maybe it was you, that it's what you're talking about isn't rare. Maybe even 40-50% of adults or something, or upon testing would have some retained reflexes, or in that neighborhood.
I find them all the time.
Yeah.
I find them in the eyes, I find them in the hands, I find them in the feet. They're there. And they're not always disruptive to the person's function. I think that's important to say. Just because they're there doesn't mean that
it's a problem
it's
necessarily.
A problem.
Yeah.
But for some folks that may have, like I was working with a woman the other day who I checked my eyes with everybody, and she was having knee pain. I looked her to the right and her body immediately fell forward. So looking in some of these ways of these sort of imbalances that can sometimes happen, or just how we're wired with that, can have an effect on a lot of different things. So it's a place that I look a lot with the kiddos and adults that I'm working with. And then from there, for a lot of the kids, I try to interact with those movements. I get them to do things, and usually a lot of sensory work to those areas. But I do, with adults, I use TRE quite a bit to allow that as another gateway point for them to sometimes see for themselves, but allow them to drive and interact with some of those movements in a very different way.
So let me linger there for a moment. So with adults, if you're feeling like you're liking the, I guess, let's call it an induction process. Something happens when TRE elicits something. How is it that you introduce that? Do you give them a full-blown, the whole shebang, all 7 the full formal process, or do you do, is there a more in the flow way that you invite that?
Yeah. So a lot of times people will, these reflexes I can show, right? I can do something to someone and then say, did you see that?
Yep.
And a lot of times they say, no, I did not. Yep. Right. But so I can show them the spontaneity right there. I'm already starting to teach them about the fact that their body can spontaneously move. And the whole idea behind some of these reflexes too is bringing people into them in some regards, or some sort of a sensory experience with that part of their body, and them having a conscious experience of it. Right. So what does TRE do in a lot of ways? It brings people into some of these motions.
Conscious awareness. Yeah.
And can bring in that mindful piece through a reflexive behavior. So I love TRE in that regards, that I usually pair the two together in a lot of ways. I'll have people doing specific movements and things that are being mindful of those areas. And then I'm using TRE to help them identify within that, sometimes allowing those behaviors to actually go deeper into. And that's where it gets interesting, because a lot of times I do see inside TRE a lot of these sort of reflexes and movements occurring.
Right.
And I can help them follow that.
So that's its own really interesting. Yeah, that's its own interesting piece. So it's like you're saying that when you watch people tremor, so let's use TRE as our framework here. When you watch people do TRE, whether you've been talking about, whether you've previously assessed or talked about reflexes, when you're observing tremoring phenomenon, because you have a trained eye around. You have that lens of reflexes. It sounds like you're saying a lot of the movements that you're seeing elicited in TRE, you're seeing the traces and the evidence of retained reflexes. Is that correct?
Yeah, or parts of them. Yeah. And so that I can then bring in the full one and give them an idea. So I know with TRE sometimes we use the word like interventions, right? So that
Yeah.
might be one of my interventions.
I've changed. I don't call it that anymore. I call it facilitations now.
That's good.
I got sick of that word. It just
Right.
sounds, it's a clinical word, but I don't like it anymore. Anyway.
Right. I like facilitations. But yeah, it's helping with the completion. So if my mind says, well, it looks like they're trying to, this looks like it could be part of that. And maybe it's not. It might not be. But
Yeah.
I think a lot of times you do see an individual trying to roll, right? You see those initial kind of rockings and rolling. So, but it's different, right? It's not, we're not dealing with an infant anymore. We're dealing with a mature adult with adults. And even
Right.
with a teenage kid or something like that, or a 5-year-old, they're beyond these places of just this linear progression. So
Right.
people that just do the linear progression of, oh, you need to bring the brain back to these steps again. It's a hodgepodge of a lot of things.
Right.
And so we got to work in a nonlinear way in what comes up on the fly type of deal. There's an art there for sure. But sometimes it's very clear, oh, a body's trying to get itself to roll and twist into that side. Here we go. So in the moment, I might try to facilitate that manually with the person. I may give them the idea and say, hey, allow yourself to go in this direction. Does it feel like you want to go left or right? Test those sides. Which one do you want to follow? And usually people are like, oh, I want to go this way. Go for it, right?
Yeah.
But other times I might, if I see that repeated a lot throughout our experience, it's, okay, I saw this a lot. I'm going to give it as an exercise. So here's my PT part of saying,
Okay.
Your body's
Yep.
trying to do this repetitively. It's looking
Yeah.
for something inside that motion, movement inside movement.
Right.
Why don't we take this home for an exercise too and drive the mindfulness of it?
Yeah.
So I find a lot of times I'm jumping sides. I'm jumping into the extreme mindfulness. Now I'm jumping back into the extreme reflex aspect and just monitoring and saying, okay, what is this person doing in the moment? Which I got from some of the TRE work, which was definitely a little bit of a game changer for me of how my thought process worked. But I trusted it. I said, these guys, David's obviously done his work. And and I've seen that with myself and some of my own body's experiences. Let's practice this. And it does have a place there, I feel like. But knowing which side or which of the fence that you want to be on at different moments, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah. Cool. Can you think of, maybe this might be our closing note. Maybe you can think of one client example that just stands out. I'm sure there's lots, but maybe one that sort of stands out to you as, where I'm thinking where spontaneous movement definitely had a major role, whether that's TRE or something else, but where in your view, that was very much a very important aspect of some transformational process or healing process for them. Just wondering if any case examples.
Yeah, so where I met my best teacher is what you're asking here.
Yeah, exactly.
So in school, actually, I think it was my second year, this woman came through. Her name was Megan. She was 19 years old, and she had a Korea. She actually she was in the paper that we put together too, as far as a case report on movement collaboration.
Okay.
And she was just the sweetest girl. She was a gymnast who grew up and just had the most beautiful movements, elegant movement, but she had Huntington's chorea. So she started to have, which is a degenerative neurological condition.
Can you say the word again? I missed it.
Huntington's chorea.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it comes with dyskinesia, which is like involuntary, aggressive kind of movements where there's not a lot of kind of patterns. Again, right? Things that we sometimes see in TRE, but again, not pathology.
Right.
So this was after probably a year or two after I think I was exploring some of my own stuff. So I had my own little bit of a language and feedback system that I was using with some of this. And I wanted to help her. She came in and talked to our class about her condition, was trying to educate us. And the whole time, I think I was just feeling, wow, like, I wonder if I can do anything. I wonder if I could do anything. And I'll ask her afterwards. She's just really brave little girl. And she was with her mother, but the whole time you could see her kind of fighting gravity and working to keep herself upright. She's amazing. She ate 9,000 calories a day, and she was skinny as a rail. I mean,
because she had so much movement, that's what you mean?
So much energy that she had to control, so that a lot of the spasticity that was happening and the dyskinesia that she was, with what was left of her voluntary system, that's what she was able to do. But she probably weighed 90 pounds soaking wet.
Wow. Okay.
But she was so positive and just talking about being there and helping us understand her in this condition.
Right.
So I asked if I could work with her a couple
Yeah.
times during the week, just as an exploratory project for me to understand more. And she was like, yeah, sure. Mom was like, I'll bring her by once a week. So I said, okay, why don't we just start? I started with the first, let me use my PT tools. Why don't we do some hand exercises where we bring the arm up and let's stretch the back. And the whole time she's bucking and her body's, but she's doing it. She's saying, this is fun. And I said, oh, this just feels like there's something missing, obviously. I said, oh, and I could just feel myself getting closer and closer and saying, all right, what if I try some manual things with her, right? And I'll try to allow myself, but I couldn't keep track of her. She was so fast with some of these motions.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, what if I just grab her hands and I just connect? Now there's some of these these practices, and I want to say like
push
Tai Chi,
hands and Tai Chi,
right? Yeah, I didn't know about them at the time, but I was like, I need to make contact because my body knows contact. If I can feel her, I can find that pre-stress of that I'm aware of, that I feel like I can move faster in. Okay. So I found that sort of position with her. And then I think from there I had ideas like, let's bring our arms up together, but again, still fast. And then I just felt my body just go immediately into some of these responses of, she was pushing me out of my equilibrium. And then I could feel my body correcting itself very much in the way that I had practiced working with these reflexes. Mm-hmm. So when I recognized that, I was like, wait a minute, okay, I can just push this back this way. But when I did that, we both would hear like an auditory response of pow, pow. So there was some sort of reorganization that happened simultaneously, reflexively for both of us. At least auditorily for me, I recognized it.
What do you mean auditorily? You mean like you literally heard a sound?
Yeah, like I felt something move on me. It was a pop, kind of crack, and then I heard on her pop and crack.
Wow, okay.
So there was
like a joint popping type of a sound?
Yeah. Which a lot of times happens when there's a reorganization at a joint. The cavitation occurs. But what do we know from that? Something is stimulated somewhere that now allows the joint to reorganize. So that was the first experience of kind of working with some of that. But it felt stable. All of a sudden, there was a stability that came in, again, very similar to some of those practices where I was moving with some of the unwinding phenomenons and finding and looking for.
But now it's two bodies to get two nervous systems together.
Two nervous systems together, yeah. So this we would practice and move, and it did. It took on a very oscillatory kind of movement practice, but I'm starting to look a little bit like her, and we're sharing some of these movement patterns, but still coming back to some of those responses, letting my body reconnect with the ground and just reorganize, co-regulate, however you want to look at it. Because I could work through her and then use the ground and coming from my feet a little bit.
Yep.
So, but over time, what ended up happening was there would be a slowing and then a pause. So, but there were these stillnesses that sort of came out. She was always moving, but they held for about 30 seconds of just complete stillness. And at one point, she even
which was
out.
Rare for her. Is that correct?
For her, there weren't really rest points.
Okay.
So we were together creating rest points.
Okay.
They were temporary, but they were happening.
Yep.
And to the point where they were coming across to her as scary. Like almost like she would yell out and say, that's never like that. What is that? It was unfamiliar. But her body was still. And mine felt in a very kind of still place as well, temporarily, until it needed to move again.
Yep.
So we followed that for a little bit. And the responses that I got, we would have multiple pauses that over time became a little bit longer each period. But very similar to TRE, her sleep patterns were better at night. She was able to basically have, her digestion was a little bit different reported from mom. She had movements available that normally she would have very much difficulty with. So I still have a lot of questions as to what happened.
How many sessions were you able to spend with her?
We did 7 or 8 sessions together. So enough to see like this was pretty significant.
Yep.
And a lot of it I look at is the same stuff we're doing with the manual following. It was just, for me, she was a little bit just faster, and it was a little bit more aggressive with some of the like forces that we were using because she had so much tone in her system. So that was a pretty, and still to this day, she drives some of the interest But I also wonder, as we start to become more advanced with this, we start to become more in tune with each individual system, what happens when we start to stack them?
Yep.
And maybe people are already out there doing that work in some ways. So, but I'm curious when you have two systems.
I'm curious too. Yeah.
Two systems running independently but operating simultaneously with awareness. What starts to happen? I don't know.
Reminds me a little bit. We talked about push hands and Tai Chi for sure. But and I haven't done a lot of this, but there's the discipline of contact improv. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
A bit of, being in relationship through contact and movement, sharing weight. Yeah, no, you're right. I'm sure there's the way you ended up working, there's commonalities probably with lots of things.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to us finding an accuracy within this for ourselves. And the trial and error process that it seems like each of us go through, but then refining it over time and becoming more accurate and essentially more energy efficient with that. Mm-hmm. And can we leverage it? Can we leverage it in more ways? Because we're not wasting as much energy in the beginning, which I feel like, at least for me, that was a process that definitely happened. Can you leverage some of this process in ways that allows healing to present faster? It probably is very fast, but in this way, do things that we're just not doing yet. And I'm curious. Yeah.
That's a very cool early teacher for you.
Yeah. And she still has me going back to the drawing board I can approach it every day and be like, were we just dancing? I come back to that too and say, were we just being weird together? And that works. I got to look at it through that lens too. But no, there was something relating to the mechanics of this all but she was just fast. She was fast. And the only time she had that other stillness, from my understanding, is a couple days before she passed. That was the only other time where there was a completion in her system.
Wow, interesting.
From what her mother said. Or sleep. I think during sleep, too, she was able to achieve places of stillness. So, but where her mother saw her, I asked her and said, when was the last time that you did see her in those states where she wasn't? And she said, the last 2 days before she passed. That's when I saw her in that state of just
stillness.
Ease. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I'm curious. What can we do with some of these conditions, too, that we're finding? I think there was a study recently published right on MS about the effectiveness of TRE. So, how like treats like in the natural world, right?
Yeah, super cool.
Yeah, it's fun.
Wow. Well, Joel, we covered a lot of ground. There's more ground I would want to cover, but it's probably, hopefully I'll be able to rope you into a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, to be continued. I mean, I think this stuff is fun. I'm still exploring. I got lots of information too if people are curious and going down the rabbit hole a little bit more. And
perfect.
Please reach out. And if there are stories that people have about some of the early experiences, especially for individuals that didn't get trained and then had some of these experiences, I would love to hear from you, because I do think in the future putting together a paper that looks more at some of the natural phenomenons of this process would be very helpful.
Would be a good direction to go.
Yeah, I think so. So. And and of course, if there's ever questions.
Totally. And there's a part of this neurogenic integration project is the intention is really to facilitate conversation and information sharing across basically what you've done in the paper there. That's the hope of this too, is Steve and I, she comes out of chiropractic world. I've got the bodywork background. Both of us had the TRE as our main training in neurogenic movement. But again, why I was so motivated, inspired by your paper, is I loved the broadness of that. How do we look at this from other professional lenses, biotensegrity, reflex integration, et cetera, but not only professional. How do we just collect information from humans? And so I'd love to share in that effort with you of just collecting these stories and case studies, and we'll certainly direct people to you and your efforts to keep going on the research side of it. I hope we can support one another in that.
Yeah, rock and roll.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, Joel, let's land here, but thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Alex.
All right.
That's it for today's episode. We hope you found inspiration and new insights into the power of neurogenic training.
If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. It really helps us reach more people interested in this transformative work.
And if you want to dive deeper, connect with us. Or to learn more about our sessions, courses, and upcoming trainings, head over to neurogenicintegration.com.